okay?
Requiem for a Dream is part of a great movement of independent filmmaking in the 90s that wanted to change the perception of American film as an art form. While a lot of people remember American cinema as Hollywood, the sort of the big studios, and that's what Hollywood provides, what Requiem offers is essentially not cinema as a mass-marketed commodity. This is the other side. This is really confronting cinema. Aronofsky had come off Pi. Pi was as independent as you get, and it was notable for the success of that production. So Aronofsky could have made anything, but what he chose to do was adapt the late 1970s novel by Hubert Selby Jr. that had always meant a lot to him. And he wanted to tell a story that it was deeply personal for him as well in terms of his own interest in psychological states and desires and addiction. So the major theme is about addiction. That addiction is not just drugs. It's addiction to media, for example. It's addiction to money. It's addiction to sex and desire. These are all themes that seem to frame this idea of what is this American cultural moment. Requiem for a Dream becomes really a kind of stern message for what will happen in American culture. And in that way, it's a moral tale, but incredibly realistic and brutal.
Anything else?
I think Aronofsky is very interested in exploring internal lives.
Nah, no, nothing, I'm right.
His films have attempted to understand deep psychologies.
Harold, please, not again, the TV.
And he's fascinated by the perception of characters and the way they experience the world. So what we see in Requiem for a Dream from frame number one is a highly expressive way of shooting the world. I can't think of many films that are as audacious in terms of visual style and sound design. He was willing to do anything to show how addiction impacts the way they perceive the world. And we're going to see a movie from the crystallized subjectivity of a character. For example, he will use a fisheye lens to radically distort space. The further the film progresses, the more space starts to get elongated, distorted. So the example of Sarah Goldfarb in a doctor's surgery with a fisheye lens. And we move immediately into this very strange kind of spatial distortion montage. Perhaps one of the most difficult scenes to watch comes from the moment when Marion, played by Jennifer Connelly, leaves a site of unbelievable trauma. And Aronofsky has the challenge: how do you capture somebody's trauma using the medium of cinema? Instead of simply tracking her movement and showing the despair that she has, he uses a Steadicam, but attaches the rig to her body. And the camera is just front and center on her face in almost an extreme close-up. The shot holds at great length because the camera is on her, and at the end, what we get is a stunningly intimate and raw portrayal of a character, a far more intimate subjectivity than you could ever get with a point of view. That's a very imaginative filmmaker using technology to really orchestrate an entirely new kind of perception.
Yeah, man. That motherfucker started looking a little seedy, Jim.
What, are you particular all of a sudden?
Hey, baby. I don't care if the motherfucker growing hair, just as long as we get our bread.
Aronofsky uses time as a way to think about how we perceive things. So the film is framed around seasons, roughly 6 months in the lives of these characters. But we know that the narrative is going to really break apart and fragment the more these people get addicted. There's a moment where Harry Goldfarb gets into a taxi. At this point, he needs a fix. And the way it works is, let the caster look As he does that, we cut to that classic montage of the use of the drugs. We cut immediately back to Leto in exactly the same position, but now his eyes are completely glazed over because he's experiencing this high. It's something so subtle that I'm sure 90% of people miss it, but it's a time ellipsis. We are brought into the lives of people horribly and grotesquely addicted to drugs. And Aronofsky is requiring us to see time in really strange and unusual ways, so we live that addiction in that sense. The human body is central to Requiem for a Dream. And in fact, I would say a larger philosophical premise in the film, that we experience our lives in a very significant way through our bodies. So Requiem for a Dream is not just about drug use or about addiction. He wants to show the effect on bodies. And some of the most confronting scenes in all of Requiem are characters going through bodily degradation of one kind or another.
And one.
Sarah Goldfarb in Unforgettable Moments in the hospital, where she goes through shock therapy, and the tightness of the way he shoots that. He wants you to be confronted with this body, the horror that it's become.
Two.
I think the Ellen Burstyn performance, what she's willing to show in that, seems to me to even exceed the level of performance trauma that I would say you see in a film like The Exorcist.
What's the problem? It's my alarm.
The wound that Jared Leto has, the needle mark that becomes so grossly infected, it's the grotesque deformities of the body in Harry Goldfarb's arm, becomes not only a very powerful image to see on the screen, and it's the kind of image that really pulls you into the rawness of that moment, but there's a clear fascination here with how do we experience the world through our bodies, and in what way are our bodies contaminated by the world that we live in.
Maid Marian, welcome.
Jennifer Connelly becomes central to an entire theme of abuse and commodification of the body. I mean, there's just an absolute galvanizing sequence where she's used, and the pain that it brings her is absolutely palpable. And I think that comes from a really powerful performance. These are actors willing to really show so much of themselves. There's a degree of simply rawness in the performances, and there's a level to which actors are, I think, willing to commit themselves to being depicted in extremely compromising ways that you rarely see.
Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes.
Say, sir.
Yes, sir.
I would say that Marlon Wayans as Tyrone is, I think, an absolute revelation. He plays a really, really important African-American figure in the setting of a drug war.
Put your spineless back into it.
But then what he captures in terms of his own bodily debasement by the state, there's a really glorious moment where he lays on a bed in a fetal position, and we get this sort of insert of a memory of Tyrone and his mother. And it just works. It works as a really beautiful bookend to all the really difficult and confronting things we've seen.
Anybody want to waste some time?
With Requiem for a Dream, the sound is as important and as carefully thought about in terms of design as the visual image. Requiem is that brilliant example of a team of people working on sound layering that creates its own level of expressivity. We get, as the visuals start to fragment and as their psychology start to fragment in the film, you notice grossly amplified sound effects. The sound of the fridge moving, for example, creates a kind of sentient monster of, a fridge. And that sound design is part of, I think, a larger aesthetic, which is all really about excess. In addition to sound design, the Clint Mansell score for Requiem for a Dream became one of the most discussed aspects of the film. Aronofsky talks about the film was going to have a hip-hop soundtrack because he had grown up in Brooklyn, he had listened to hip-hop music, and that's the kind of feel of this world. And so there's a very strong sense of a beat in the soundtrack of this film, which I think is so important because repetition is just so critical to the way this movie works. That for me is the real genius of it. That repetitive beat structure seems to me to match this idea of endless repetition in the lives of these addicted people. In the same way that they experience their drugs in measured, repetitive beats, the music accompanies that exposure to the drugs and the use and the addiction. The film is called Requiem for a Dream, and a requiem is a mass for the dead and our commemoration of that event. The music that accompanies that is usually melancholy, but it should be emotive and it should allow us to reflect. I would say that the Mansell score perfectly captures this. That by the end, what I'm left with is this kind of musical accompaniment to a funeral, to the ending of things. And that takes me back to the overarching theme of the film. It's a requiem for an American dream. And I don't think that's overstating the ambition of the film. It's clearly in a larger tradition of films that are trying to interrogate what is the nature of this American cultural moment. It's about addiction, it's about disease, deformity, and therefore the musical score functions as a kind of requiem accompaniment.
On our way, baby. We are on our way.
I do think the legacy of Requiem for a Dream has been very strong. It's always a noted film in terms of its influence on later filmmakers. Requiem will always be that bold experiment that suggested the capacity for independent filmmaking to do something extremely experimental, sophisticated, and challenging. Requiem is what we really need from a lot of cinema. There should be a space for films to be uncompromising. Requiem is one of those films, and it makes it possible for other films to continue to do that.